the duo.
Perfect.
Yeah. All right. Are we good? All right. So feel free to ask questions while I'm giving this talk. A lot of this is about sort of clarifying aspects of Maui, making sure everyone's sort of clear on what we're doing with it, what the direction is, what the goal is, what we're not doing with it, how much we are or are not exploding everything up. Because I know there's been a little bit of trepidation around it. So yeah, I just kind of wanted to talk through that. So I'll do that. I'll show some samples with it. And then if we have time, I have a little bit of work I actually did against Sextant and some dual screen stuff if time permits. But yeah, just ask questions about anything that comes up and I will cover it. So to get us at a starting point, let's look at the current Xamarin Forms architecture. So just kind of understanding the way everything's put together. So renderers are tightly coupled to Xamarin Forms components, right? So basically you have a button renderer takes a dependency on a Xamarin Forms button. So in the button renderer, you have hard references to a forms button, which is a bindable object, which has like iNotify property, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And the way all that works is assembly scanning. Assembly scanning is really slow. Basically what happens is that Xamarin Forms goes through and it scans all of your assemblies for any assembly attributes, and then it automatically registers those to the framework as being what's used for those components. What that does is it means that it takes you take a really big hit on the front end. So this is kind of how the render architecture works. It spins up, Xamarin grabs all of your assemblies, it scans through all the assemblies for types, and then it registers those types, which works. It's great in the sense that it, in theory, tries to remove some requirements from the user, but it doesn't really perform as desired. The other thing is that it's really difficult to reach the native platform from the cross-platform aspect because of the way that the dependency tree works. The renderer depends on the button. So the button has no concept of a renderer. When you're in the context of a button, you can't interact with the renderer. So you basically have to go, if you want to do anything native, say at any native level, you have to register your own custom renderer and then register it against a custom button. And then at that point, interact with it however you want. Or you can use these very confusing APIs that are effectively just mapping native specific properties to cross-platform concepts. So things like blur effect and like that, they're literally just setting a value on a native property. Like they don't really do anything that exciting. I've told this story a few times. I was actually a Xamarin Forms developer for about 2 or 3 years. I didn't even know platform specifics existed until I started working for Xamarin Forms. So the API experience there leaves a lot to be desired. All right, so one of the goals with .NET MAUI is to decouple the renderers from Xamarin Forms. So the idea here is that we're effectively inverting the dependency tree. So now the Xamarin Form button depends on iButton. And then the iButton is what's used by the button handler. So the button handler now only knows about an iButton, and that's it. It doesn't know anything about a Xamarin Forms button. It has no concept of what that is. So now what this allows you to do is map multiple concepts to, what this allows you to do then is use different types of controls if you want. For example, this allows Comet to kind of create its own buttons. Fabulous can create its own buttons, and you can even have a reactive button. So these are all controls that have that would have no concept of what Xamarin Forms is. It would have no dependencies on Xamarin Forms. It would purely be a reactive button with an I button and a button handler, and the whole Xamarin Forms aspect of it just completely goes away. So that's what's enabled by this architecture here that we're putting together. So a lot of the idea driving this is performance minded and simplified. So just simplifying everything down so that you're a lot less boxed in. Because especially if you're a new developer and you're starting from, say, the XPlat side, it's really confusing understanding how to get to the renderer or how sort of all these magic little bits work. It's also really difficult to access anything from the XPlat. So what we're doing is we're sort of moving everything into the cross-platform side so that you can access things from within the context of your shared application. So you'll see some samples of this in code after the PowerPoint. But yeah, basically you can register any set of handlers you want. And we're gonna have obviously a set of default ones, but then you can kind of swap those in and out. A lot of that is for the purpose of, one, getting rid of the assembly attributes because the assembly attributes are confusing. Probably took me like 5 years before I could type one of those without having to copy and paste it from somewhere. But yeah, so you could basically register, you can access it from a native context. Anybody who's done cross-platform will recognize sort of like the if-deffing. That's mainly used for the purpose of the demo. You could also put it in shared files, however, whatever floats your multi-targeting boat. So also zero runtime assembly scanning, because we don't want to take that performance hit. If you're running a website, doesn't matter if it's crazy slow at the beginning, because if that first user is slowed down, which is usually you, making sure your website's working, doesn't really matter. But for mobile app, startup time is everything. That's why even some of the that's why Splat and those are really cool, because Splat is super fast. It doesn't do any like crazy scanning or anything like that you need to do that sort of overcomplicate on the, ooh, a queue's name. If I click this, will it like show a queue that I can A? Ooh, hey, Erland, how are you doing? Good to see you. How many developers are working on Maui team? Let's see, answer live. Done. So efficient. How many are working on it right now? Oh man, you're gonna make me count the team. That's a tricky question, I would have to say, because there's a lot of aspects to .NET MAUI, which I talk about a little bit later. So working on, say, this raw code aspect is the Xamarin Forms team, which I don't know, 6 or 7. I'd have to count through the people. Let me see. When I at people, it says 8 in teams. So if we minus David, I'd say 7. Yeah, I'd say 7. And then one of those is Sam, who's the project manager, and then David, who's doing a lot of the project management. But there's a lot of aspects of MAUI that extend beyond just these things. For example, a lot of the single project aspects, Jonathan Dick's working on a lot of how the single project's gonna work. All the .NET 6 stuff applies to MAUI, so you know, the Android team, et cetera, et cetera. So as far as like the team, I mean, it's largely most of Xamarin that are working towards making, you know, making a product infrastructure that MAUI can live on top of as well. So yeah, there's like 7 of us working on, say, the core bits here.
Just a quick question I have is that going to be what you do in production with the if mono Android, or would you have separate target assemblies at the end that you would register stuff in, or how would it work?
Some of the stuff, I mean, is still being evolved, but I mean, the idea is that so this is kind of an example of a user project. So some of that's going to take shape based on what, a lot of that's hard to answer because it depends on what the single project experience is going to look like once .NET 6 and all that stuff get more built into Visual Studio. So really whatever that experience turns out to be is going to sort of drive this structure. So like right now MAUI is used, and I can show you, let me make a note, targets file. Right now MAUI just has a general targets file that we're using that sort of standardize the type of naming conventions for different files. Like inside the Maui code, this would probably be our default initializers would be in like a .android file. And that's going to be targeted. That's just going to be, a multi-targeted DLL, so that there's going to be a platform handlers DLL that's all monodroid built, et cetera, et cetera.
So it's similar to what we do in our CY. We have
Yeah.
platforms.
Yeah. I just use the ifdefs for presentations because it's easier than clicking around separate files. So yeah, but it all just depends. So in theory, this experience is going to be not in theory, but once this experience has been developed in Visual Studio, it'll be something that's super useful for users. So I know I forget the conference, but we call them Kazoo, but yeah, Kazoo demoed sort of some theoretical project experiences where you could have like a project and there'd be like an Android folder and an iOS folder, et cetera. So yeah, a lot of this stuff is still being discussed, how we want to surface that out in Visual Studio. So if you're interested in having some of those conversations about how would you like Visual Studio to interact with a multi-targeted project, we'd be curious to hear from that. So there's always those conversations of like, is it better to separate them by folders? Is it better to separate them by dots, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, the Maui solution does everything by file extensions, mainly just because that's how Clancy had first set it up. So yeah. The goals with .NET Maui. All right, removing confusing APIs. So this is referring back to the platform specifics and the renderers. I know I've mentioned this like so many times, but like the renderers are just the worst. So the idea, and then this will sort of, this will resonate some more with, I think, some of the reactive crowd, is that a lot of the Maui hooks are functional based, but you also have access to the native bits from a cross-platform standpoint. So if I have a Xamarin Forms label, I can just access the text view from a cross-platform context. I don't have to go to the renderer. I can just access it from the cross-platform side. So whatever the cross-platform experience looks like, you could say, add an iOS version of this file or control, and then you could interact with that control as if you're in an iOS scenario. So yeah, a lot of it is, that's what's sort of brought on by that inversion that I was talking about earlier, where now the Xamarin Forms is taking dependency on the renderer as opposed to the renderers taking dependency on Xamarin Forms. Boop. So what Maui is not. I just wanted to sort of cover a few points here. A lot of this stuff should probably propagate out to what kind of impact will have UI tests such as, what kind of impact will I have UI tests such as the UI tests, if any impact? No impact. So it'll all be the same. So that'll play into, let me write that down, UI test. Cool. So yeah, that actually dovetails perfectly into this answer. It's almost as if I planned that. Answer live. Done. What Maui is not. Oh, I think I have an extra animation in there. There we go. Maui is not a complete rewrite of Xamarin Forms. So Maui is not an Angular JS to Angular 2.0 type shift. It's not anything that, it's not an Android to Android X type thing. It's the Xamarin Forms itself stays the same. 90% of what's rendered stays the same. And everything. So all the accessibility stuff stays the same, the way the automation IDs stay the same. Actually, to kind of talk into that point, ideally the Xamarin UI test stuff gets better, because I know on the Android side, it's a little tricky with the way some of the ID aspects work. So ideally it'll get better, but it won't change. It's not completely incompatible with Xamarin Forms. So if you have a Xamarin Forms application and you switch to a Maui application and you have no renderers, it should be a fairly smooth experience. There might be some subtleties, like some layout differences, some that we want to try to avoid. But there's certain aspects of layout that we're wanting to improve with Maui. For example, a lot of the things that have to do with height and width. It'd be ideal to make those work a little more like deterministic. So min height means min height, height means height, and max height means max height. To sort of allow more fluidity there. But on the Xamarin Forms side, all the Xamarin Forms controls will still work. So worst case, anything that's deprecated will be in sort of shim or legacy packages. But otherwise, Xamarin Forms still stays Xamarin Forms. So if you have a reactive UI application that's written against Xamarin Forms, it'll still work. It's still a control throwing a notify property changed event that reactive UI hears and does stuff to. So, you know, the XPlat layer is staying exactly the same. There's nothing changing there. It's still all the same stuff. So anything built against Xamarin Forms, you know, like Prism Forms is a purely cross-platform solution against Xamarin Forms. It doesn't have any native aspects. It's an abstraction of the Xamarin Forms abstraction. So, you know, Prism will still work with Xamarin Forms. So the only things that'll be different is maybe some things will be in a different binary and things like that. So we'll have to sort of figure out the best way you want to do any sort of forwarding or things like that. So what is it? Dun, da, da. Xamarin Forms controls will still be the same controls, right? So you'll basically have a label, but now we'll put an iLabel on it. You'll have a stack layout, we'll put an iStack layout on it. You'll have a label renderer, we'll put an iView handler on it. Bada bing, bada boom. Now at that point, that makes it so that these Xamarin Forms controls work with .NET MAUI handlers. Ooh, yeah, these questions are great. DI container, we better. There's definitely a lot of conversation going along the DI container stuff. So, I mean, unless that for some reason just gets totally nixed, that's a big thing I'm pushing for, is to especially pull in a lot of the Microsoft hosting things is what we want to pull in so that it's a familiar experience for .NET developers. I have a demo put together. There's a couple demos floating out there. James did one demo. I did a demo with Shell where it basically can dependency inject into everything. So like you can specify a data template and it'll new up your view that'll dependency inject stuff into the view or the view model that's associated with it. So yeah, everyone's super excited about using the hosting extensions for things to really open up a lot of those scenarios. So
you should see the screams coming from the chat just then.
Yeah, so that's the mindset right now. Everybody's mindset is that's what we're going to be using. So a lot of times things don't survive excitement. So if it's not coming out near, just, you know, anything, I mean, because the thing is that the due date, it's coming out in end of November, November 21 is when we're planning for official release. So a lot of things could change, but right now I'll show you in a little bit. Right now there's an issue up. I have a bunch of notes in there talking about what I want it to look like. Even the team who's in charge of a lot of the hosting stuff, they even outside of our request created a sample of what it might look like. Like everybody's thinking about this right now. It's like, you know, everybody going through the same ages in history, right? All the different societies, no matter where they are, we're all still we're all honing in on this same hosting service stuff. So yeah, I don't know. I think it'd be awesome.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I had a quick follow-up for you on that one, Shane.
Okay.
What about our good friend dependency service?
Yeah, so that's the dependency service that comes with the hosting extension stuff.
No, just inside of Forms today.
Oh, right. I see what you're saying. Yeah, I mean, the hope would be to sort of just convert that over. So I talk about that on the issue as well. The hope there would be to transition that dependency service to just use the iService provider, I think is what it is on the hosting side. so that we don't break anyone that's using dependency service. But if people want to keep using that same dependency service API, it'll be backed by iService Provider.
Awesome.
Yeah. All right. So talking a little about the shim stuff, current renderer implementations with Xamarin Forms, right? It's an iVisual element renderer. So iVisual element renderer is what drives, is what powers all the renderers at the native level. Everything that, this is how the layout system or anything interacts with a native component. The native component implements its interface, and then at that point, the layout system or whatever can tell that native component things. It can tell it how it wants to lay out. It can ask the component, hey, what size do you want to be, et cetera, et cetera. So to sort of compare these two different things, so we have iVisual element render, so that's the older stuff. And then the new stuff, iViewHandler, is Maui. If you compare the two, they're very much the same. I mean, all it really is a new interface that we can move things to that represent controls using new implementations. But as you can see, it's the same stuff. But it's all based on interfaces. So set view is like set element. Update value is the same as element property changed, because we're removing all the stuff we're removing all the eventing and things like that. It's all very non-opinionated. Your native view is your control. It's your view up here. Get desired size, set frame. Set frame's a bit more powerful in this respect, because what we're doing is we're making it more, we're being a lot more aggressive about projecting the sizing information from the cross-platform to the native platforms, which is going to really help us with performance stuff. So here's kind of a look at the iViewHandler and the iView. iView, this is the stuff that any cross-platform UI toolkit will implement. So this is just the stuff that your button might implement. iViewHandler, that's your native side.
So just a quick question with the sizing stuff. Like Mac at the moment is very bad at sizing correctly the Xamarin Mac, because you use NS views and all that sort of stuff, which doesn't always size nicely. How are you going to handle those platform intricacies, I guess?
I probably won't be able to answer that specifically. But I will say whoever implements that will deal with that. So that's the idea, is that we want to, the hope is to make it, the intention is to make it so that it can be very, because right now there's a lot of really confusing ways that the things get laid out. So the hope there is to greatly simplify the layout strategy, so that you could very much articulate the sizing you want of something, and then it'll then force whatever on the native platform to be that size. Because one of the complaints we definitely get is that the layout, laying out things isn't very deterministic on forms. So I don't know if you guys can hear my cat. He's grumpy, the door is closed. Yeah, so I can't speak to the specifics of that. Glenn, I know you've done a lot of the macOS stuff, so especially once we start dissecting those, I'd be really interested to, I'd be really interested to get your thoughts on that stuff. So I haven't done a lot of the macOS stuff. Rui and Javier have done a lot of that, so I'm not too much of an expert over there. Yeah, so kind of comparing the way this stuff works. All right, cool. Yeah, so we can talk about that. Yeah, I mean, Shell will still be part of Maui, and yeah, a lot of the navigation stuff will be built into VM navigation. I don't know if that'll be something that we naturally have, but the hooks will, especially from the Shell side, should make that very easy. So, because VM navigation, even with Shell right now, is fairly trivial to implement. So there's kind of a line we have to walk, right? Because we don't want Maui to be too opinionated of an MVVM framework, but we want it to have the capabilities to be powerful enough where people could just use it if they want to. So especially a lot of the stuff we've spiked with Shell, like if you look at the large PR I had for the MVVM stuff that's going to shift over to Maui, like if that stuff gets implemented, a lot of times you wouldn't really even need a larger MVVM framework because it would handle a lot of the stuff you would need through those things. So yeah, and also it's leaving navigation up to the platform. So like you said here, exactly with MVU stuff. So, you know, MVU and things like that might kind of take a different opinion on it. So it's sort of trying to allow enough leeway for things to do their own thing and not taking on too much ourselves, if that makes sense. So that's another big push with the Maui stuff. And as you might have seen, we moved a lot of things to the community toolkit. So the reason we did that is that we really want to focus down and make the platform itself very targeted and functional, so that it can be you know, very useful, very fast, very extendable, et cetera, et cetera. So we don't want the vision on it to get too skewed, if that makes sense. So this is kind of like what our current renderers look like. If you've seen the renderers, a lot of them are very closed down. They're scary. It's these huge if statements. There's a lot of consistency problems. A lot of the methods for the behaviors are all private. They never really were supposed to be, but that's just kind of the direction that it's gone. So yeah, view handler strategy is more function-based. So the idea here, and we'll show some examples, just keep eye on the time here, is that everything is going to boil down to extension methods effectively. So the current strategy is that all of the behaviors, so like that update text you saw before, is all going to be part of extension methods. It's all going to be public methods that you can apply to really anything. So this is very useful too, because these are features of things that you can use even outside of, say, a handler. It's basically just saying this is how we apply a text idea to a text element, which is also very powerful for cross-platform, because since the way these all work is it creates a standard API across all your platforms. So for example, these extensions, we could have this here take in a handler, and then all you really have to do at that point is say like update text, iText, and that's it. And then it'll automatically operate to the correct platform, because every single platform is going to have the same implementation of this update text method, right? So yeah, so I don't know. There's just kind of different things you can do there. We can kind of show the handler stuff doesn't survive too well staring at it in a PowerPoint. So it's a little more useful to see in implementation. So basically it's effectively just a dictionary of functions. So before, when you saw this property change thing, all this is really doing here is mapping strings to methods, right? That's all this is doing. This is just doing a string comparison and then calling a method. That's literally all that the mapper is doing, but it's standardizing that to a structure and something that's more pluggable, something that's more functional. So for example, you can see here we're passing in different mappers. They're chainable, which is, I guess that'd be like a decorator pattern, right? So you can basically decorate the mappers and wrap them in these different layers so that they pass up through the chain. So it's this idea of doing inheritance, but doing it through the other thing. I'm blanking on the word. It's sort of like weaving the functions in, opposed to being stuck sort of with these rendering points. So just to sort of push the point, handlers are really just a reorganization, right? So all we're really doing is you take a label renderer and we move it to an extension. That's really what it comes down to with the shifting around of the renderers. It's basically taking all the renderers, creating a consistent and common API and a common consistent API that users can use. But so this kind of plays into some of the, oh, I didn't write done. It's interesting you have to write answer and done. All right, is Maui all about the renderers? No, it's not. I think I put an extra animation there. All right, it's all about simplifying everything down. So everything else that Maui is about is what's the really exciting part, right? So the renderer stuff is pretty neat. It's obviously nice being able to access the native controls, but there's so many other things, right? The whole single project mindset. For example, we're having a lot of conversations about eliminating your application heads, right? So like right now in Xamarin Forms, you have Xamarin Forms, and then you have then platform heads, which have like an app delegate, a forms app activity, and like an app an app XAML file. And then you have the forms application, right? So what if we can condense all of that down so all you have is an application? You just have an app that you inherit from. And then if you switch to a iOS context, that's the iOS stuff. And then if you switch to a UWP, that app has this other class. And then we can also then project a lot of those native events out to the XPlat in a simpler way, right? So those are all the really cool things that start to happen once you're sort of shifting everything to single project. And a lot of that is enabled by the .NET 6 stuff. So once Android, iOS, and all of those move to, say, like the Net 6 targets. And then once we can start building those. And a lot of it is about being future forward with the design and UI paradigm. So everything is moving out to interfaces, right? So all the shapes are moving to interfaces, all of the types are moving to interfaces. So at some point, because now we have drawing APIs, we're gonna start creating more drawn controls. For example, the radio button right now on iOS is using drawn elements. So now we can define that radio button through interfaces of being drawn, and someone could implement sort of Skia drawers for that radio button at this point. So a lot of it is just poising the framework to easily be able to pivot to these other scenarios. And then especially pulling more control template stuff in. If you want to see the beginnings of this, go check out the radio button that just got checked in. That's our first permutation of this into 5.0. So Easy did an excellent job on that one because iOS doesn't have a radio button. So he's effectively drawing it with ellipses, and then you can specify your own control template, and you can use a content presenter, and then it has like a visual statement, the whole 9 yards for that type of control structure that you can put together. And shell, all the shell you always wanted and then some. Yeah, I mean, shell's gonna be a big strategy with the Maui stuff. So tell me what you hate, tell me what you love, and let's get it shaped. A lot of the stuff I know that we need to kind of push through, but a lot of it's gonna be the integrations we can do with the hosting stuff, better integrations with MVVM frameworks, etc. So yeah, it's all about how we can Mauify it to the best extent. If you want to sort of follow, if you sort of want to follow along with any of the Maui stuff, you can check the .NET Maui repository. If you had created an issue over there and I moved it to discussion, I'm sorry about that. But right now, what the idea here is that we're moving anything that users want questions about or discuss or that want to know about, we're putting those in discussions, and then we're keeping the issues as sort of a clear idea of where we're talking about enhancements and things that are going to be proposed, et cetera. So that, because we want people to have a very clear idea when they go to Maui repository what the strategy is there. So READMEs, things need to be updated in pending. So yeah, so other things, control templates. This was an example of Dave's control template. Microsoft extension hosting. So this was the hosting and dependency injection that I talked about. These are just kind of highlighting some of the features. Fixing stuff with the layouts, making the layouts more deterministic. All of the layouts are moving also to interfaces. So, you know, Comet or any of those can implement their own stack layout that implements the iStack layout, and then our logic can lay it out successfully. So I might just shift to the demo since we're getting to about 20 minutes. Yeah, a lot of it is about defining the cross-platform strategy. And yeah, so here, .NET Maui. So you can go, this is the right window, right? Yeah. So you can go to GitHub here to .NET Maui. and you can see the issues currently what's being accepted and what we're working on. And here's different proposals that we're talking about. So here's, you can already see there's a good amount of conversation on this. Andrew is also, he's fun to talk to about this stuff. But yeah, I think in here I talk about dependency service. Yeah, here we go. Convert our dependency service to use iService collection. So that was something that we that I looked at when I was first kind of spiking this out. So
Hey, Shane,
yeah.
we did have another question come in really quick.
Yeah.
What will the support for third-party controls be like?
I'm not too sure what that means. Let me think. Like Telerik and those things, I guess they're asking.
Yeah, that's my assumption.
I mean, those will all work. So yeah, I mean, we're still, like I said, everything shims over pretty easily. So anything that those third-party controls have used that are based on forms components will work fine. Anything based on renderers, it depends how they built them, but it's all just interface driven. So
But you'd have to wait until there's a Telerik version of the control, right? It's not a, you just can't take the Xamarin Forms one now and plug it in. Is that correct?
It depends how it's built is what that sort of comes down to. So that's what, so for example here, okay, let me kind of show a demo here. So this is kind of a demo I put together where I've registered these different types of renderers, right? So this is a label renderer, right? This is an existing label. So this is the existing label renderer that's in Xamarin Forms. And this is this is a button renderer that's in Xamarin Forms as well. And that's what it's using to render these things. It's using those existing renderers. So, and then the way I did that was to basically just, do I still have it up? I don't know if I still have it up. Was I basically just took the base class on view render. Here, no, that's the wrong one. Is this it? Here it is. I took our base class view render. I implemented iViewHandler like that, and then I just implemented those interfaces. Right, so I just went through and I did the set frame. I did all of those things. So for scenarios where controls are like they'll most likely have to rebuild against the MAUI DLLs to work, but it's not going to be, say, a large shift. We're going to sort of look in that deeper as we develop and as we start to put out the demo, the previews. There it is. We'll interact with the third-party developers to make sure that whatever the migration is, it's as painless as possible. And I mean, the plan is to support Forms 5.0 for 2 years after release. So it's going to be still supported up until 2023. So yeah, but ideally the migration over is going to be pretty simple. But yeah, I mean, all I did was take this iViewHandler and implemented it. That's it. So for example, if you have a custom renderer that's implementing button renderer here, then your button renderer should just work once you go over to MAUI. You're not going to have the button renderer implements view renderer. Now when you recompile it, it'll be inheriting from, because you don't even have to recompile it, do you? The only thing you'd have to recompile is depending on how we do the DLLs, because these are going to most likely move to a different binary. So we might have to type forward, but it should still be API compliant. So yeah, I mean, we're still developing that story, exactly how the migration is going to be, but it's not going to be like you set it up and everything blows up and you have to totally rewrite your renderer. Like all these renderers are doing, all the renderers do is place things on the screen, right? They're not like these, they're just placing native components onto a screen. So if you look at it, I mean, that's all it does. So it's just setting a frame, and things like that. So, you know, anybody that needs to implement this interface will provide samples of how you can kind of do that themselves, or provide like a proxy class, for example, where you could just instantiate like a proxy view handler that would map things to your own custom renderers. So it just depends. But that only really comes up if you're not using any of our renderer base classes, if you're only doing the custom ones. So, all right, hopefully that's not sounding a little too confusing. Something like that's a little easier to map out. But yeah, third-party components, it should be very minimal for them to provide the next level of components. But yeah, so we'll see what that migration strategy looks like as we start integrating with them, working with them more, if that makes sense. So Q&A. Any plans to create Skia renderers? Not with our team currently. Clancy has been developing Skia renderers for Comet. So the plan is to build the infrastructure for those, to better build the infrastructure for those capabilities, so that we can adapt to those types of things much better. So for example, shifting all of our draw APIs to work much better off of interfaces. Clancy has a decent amount of stuff written, but that's not part of the current strategy, but it is, it is always something that we're interested in exploring. So let's see. All right, so let's see, let's kind of talk about the app stuff here real quick. Just kind of, I can give a quick demo as the time's ticking along here. So basically, all we have on this application that I've launched are these set of views, right? So this is a forms label. I kind of created a different set of labels here to demo different ideas. So you see, this is a Xamarin Forms label here. This is this reactive label I created that I can show you here in a second. These are these custom entry controls that Javier created. This is a custom user control that you might create. And here's like a Xamarin Forms button. These are all sort of, you have these handlers here that are all registered to these types. All the Xamarin Forms stuff will be sort of abstracted away, so you won't have to like do these all yourself. But you can register, you can do all this yourself from the shared context. So just to sort of show that here, see, this is all from this multi-targeted sample project here. So yeah, that's, yeah, so let me sort of demo how the basics of these handlers here work. So the idea of the handler, I can kind of build it up here. If you look at a label handler, this label handler here is the common class. So this is the class that all of the platforms share, right? So here's all the different functions that build up this dictionary of our label mapper. And then what happens is on each platform, you fill in what those functions do. So here's the map property text, here's the update text color, and then the rest of these, which Javier has filled in on a different PR. But that's the basics of it. So then what this lets you do is this lets you sort of weave your own logic in there and do whatever you want with these mappers. So for example, the way you can tie this in here is what I've done here is I've taken the view handler. So the view handler is a common handler. So like if we go to button handler, you'll see that the button handler here passes the view handler in. So this is that wrapping I was talking about. So any property changes that don't exist on this button mapper get forwarded to this view mapper here. And what I've done is I've registered sort of my own function here to have my own custom behavior. And what I've done is I've said, okay, if this is a custom label, then I want you to do this different behavior. I want you to turn purple. So that's one of the, so like that's one of the demos that Clancy always likes to show, especially with this stuff, is that you can just tap in at any level. So if you wanted to, for example, you could do something like this. You could do something like this. And now what this is doing, did I cast it as a viable class? Yeah. So now what this is doing is that this static method here to set the background is called by literally every single class. So, and I think I tested this, so hopefully it survives testing. Yeah, see now everything, all these things, these entries here are all purple, right? Because this is all being called, all of these things call the exact same mapper. So this is kind of a way that I've now created an inheritance strategy, right? So I've inherited from, you could think of it as I've now sort of injected an inheritance point from the view renderer. I've inserted my logic, and then now it's calling the other. Now I'm doing my own logic, and then now I'm doing my own logic, and then letting it move on. So if you were doing something like inheritance, for example, it would look like this. Like this would be the equivalence of doing like inheritance, right? So this is like calling base.update background color, and this is now calling my own logic. So it's kind of creating this common point to access your to access the behavior of sort of when properties are updating. Yeah, and the neat thing here, let me show you kind of some of the stuff you can do. Let me show you a reactive label. So one thing I did here was I created a reactive label. So if you look, this is a React view. React view inherits from reactive objects, and it implements iView. And then reactive label implements iLabel. And then what happens here is that I just register the reactive label with a label handler. So the label handler handles all the text, the messaging. And then inside the reactive label, I can just forward any of the updates on the property changed to update value, which tell the handler to update. So it's a little easier to play with once you start playing with it, of course. But yeah, so that's the thing, is now I've kind of created my own reactive view. And so you can create your own reactive view. You could create your own reactive stack layout, and then you could create your own reactive content page. And now you have this UI framework that has literally nothing to do with Xamarin Forms whatsoever, and is purely reactive stuff built on top of the handlers. So that's a big thing that Comet's going to do, and that's a big thing that like Fabulous is going to do, because they don't want to work on any of the INPC stuff, right? So that's where sort of that pivoting comes from, especially with building out different controls. So for example, if someone builds, for example, if someone wants to build a Skia button, the Skia button just has to implement iButton, and then that Skia button can kind of now work with stuff. So it's ensuring it's sort of removing a lot of the cruft of forms, making it very simplified down. Yeah, and making it sort of lean and mean. So that's the, let's see if there was any other points I wanted to make on these components here. Nope, those are all the main points I wanted to make on the on these components here. Yeah, and then, oh yeah. So then the other thing here is that this gives you, yeah, so you can access any of the native components as well, right? So that was kind of like what I was saying from the cross-platform context. Remember, this is all your XPlat code. So you can just grab a label, and on that label, you can grab the handler and then do whatever you want to it. So you have access to all the native components from the cross-platform toolkit. Yeah, any other questions? Any numbers on performance gain? So I did a really stupid sample to just, I don't know. It's probably, it's kind of silly, but I did this because why not? The performance is a big thing. Performance is a huge focus of a lot of this. So so right now what we're starting with, so let me pull back the curtain a little bit, since some of you might have your doubts here. So what this is here, this application here, right now it doesn't have, say, a cross-platform layout. all that's happening is these are creating native controls, and it's placing these in a relative layout. So it's so that's almost as fast as you can get, right? There's no assembly scanning, nothing. So what we're doing is we're starting from the performance aspect of a native Android application, and ensuring that there's minimal overhead from our side of things. That's a big thing of removing the assembly scanning, right? So the performance aspects are going to be a deep analysis point as Maui is being developed. It's going to be a very incremental aspect of it to ensure that the performance is going to be better. So yeah, a lot of performance. Ruby's doing a lot of really cool stuff, making sure all the startup times are being traced and all of those things. And then if you want to see, I might have to kind of remember how I put this together. I put this really silly demo together because why not? Yeah, that's kind of a far-reaching goal as well. Is that in theory, Blazor could create? In theory, you could. Yeah, you could create Blazor.
Another quick question. Those assembly registers for the attributes for the your handlers, could you do some sort of source generator stuff with that so you get a compile time hit rather than a runtime one?
We're definitely looking into that one as well, as far as source generators versus the registration, and kind of how that'll look. I mean, a lot of the way this registration is going to probably look in the end is you're probably going to have, I forget what the exact syntax is, but like when you're doing Microsoft hosting stuff, right? You have like services.use forms renderers. And then if you install a package, you would be like, use Prism. Here's like a service locator type thing where you could now define settings, use Apple login or something like that. That's kind of one of the strategies we're looking at, because that's sort of a familiar way, especially from the ASP.NET Core side of things.
Yeah, because you could definitely reduce a lot of code there by having a builder, like you've got a lot of registrar.handlers.
Yeah, we're looking at that. But the thing is too, is we don't want to make the registrar too smart, because there's kind of some intermingling there that gets a little bit complicated. For example, like the visual ones, trying to register visual handlers like material over things, like it just gets a little bit crazy, all the different permutations. So it's one of those things where we don't want to overcomplicate. We don't want to overcomplicate this where it's not needed. But the registrar is something that's definitely, it's still being developed. This was sort of just like to get it running, tying the stuff together. So this is another thing we're talking to a lot of single project stuff about. This was my super silly demo of, yeah. So if everyone's seen this, it's a silly performance.
Is that frames per second?
It's nothing. It's a timer that you make up so that your framework looks cool.
Awesome.
But the one cool thing about it, I'll just say this and hand it to you, is that you do see a performance difference here if you switch from the Maui handler to the if you do switch between the Maui handler to the other one, to the original
Forms
one.
handler?
Yeah, it's still performant, but it's interesting because you actually do see it gain about 500 or so. But yeah, I mean, it's basically just every time, every second, it's seeing how many modifications it could make to an array of texts is basically what it's doing. So it's just kind of a copy of the other things that people had sort of put together. But yeah. So, and then, yeah, see, here's the one now using the Maui one, and you can see this is now running 3 times faster. So that's the thing, is that let's start here where it's rendering super fast and then make sure we stay at that point. So yeah, so there you go.
I have to say, as somebody who dabbles in building custom renderers, just the way that you manage property changes and whatnot in the new that new, structure with just kind of listening to that dictionary of properties and then their methods to handle their updates is wonderful. It's so much easier to work with.
Yeah, yeah, we're really excited about that. And so it'll be cool because you could either go through the dictionary, or if you have, if you want to use these extension methods to apply the same behavior. So it's just trying to make it open and as consistent as possible. It is a big push. So that performance, single projects, like so much. There's so much happening right now in .NET that we can leverage. It's like it's hard to even stay focused on what we need to focus on sometimes.
It's a good problem to have, right?
Yeah, with all the .NET 6 stuff and things like that. Like I'm super excited to see by the end of next year what the whole Xamarin ecosystem looks like with .NET 6 out there. It's going to be awesome. It's going to make Uno look awesome, Avalonia, everything. It's all going to look awesome. So yeah, cool. Well, thank you. Yeah, thank you for everyone. Thank you for having me. Yeah, thank you, Reactive UI community. It's probably one of the first open source communities I was ever part of. Thank you, Annie, for being super helpful to me in my beginning journey. I think Annie was the one who actually taught me about first chance exceptions. I logged a issue on like the Google group, I think where everything used to be logged.
Mm-hmm.
She had pointed out how to catch some of those exceptions. So yeah, I mean, the whole reactive UI community has probably been the largest boost of skills that I've ever achieved from learning reactive and interacting with that community. So yeah, it's a great community. Go over to Slack. Everyone on there is super excited to help. Rodney, Glenn, everybody, Michael, everybody. So yeah, thank you again for everything. And Michael, take it away.
Appreciate it. Yeah. Awesome talk. Thanks, man.